In the silence of the abandoned halls, something deeply unsettling hangs in the air, almost tangible. A place that was once a bustling, functioning part of a hospital, now left forgotten and sealed off as though it never existed. For years no one dared to step inside. The locked doors, the boarded-up windows, the faded signs that had once pointed the way to the now infamous wing. It was as though a chapter of the hospital's history had been erased from memory altogether. No one talked about it. No one even acknowledged its existence. The hospital had moved on. The wing had been locked, its doors sealed, and its story buried. But why? The hospital itself was a grand institution, well known in the medical world for its groundbreaking treatments and its long-standing reputation. Founded in the early 20th century, it had been hailed as a beacon of medical innovation, home to some of the country's most prestigious surgeons, scientists, and doctors. Its halls echoed with the sounds of hope, healing, and progress. For decades, it had served the city, offering both cutting-edge treatments and compassionate care to all who entered its doors. But within this proud institution, one wing stood out for reasons that would not be uncovered until much later. An entire section of the building that had been locked away without a single explanation. For years, the hospital was a place where people came to heal, to recover, to seek treatment. It was a symbol of modern medicine, a place that represented the very best of what healthcare had to offer. But behind its pristine walls, the hospital held dark secrets, secrets that no one dared to speak of. There was a hidden past, one that had been carefully concealed by those in power. The sealed wing was just one part of a larger story, a story filled with unanswered questions, strange disappearances, and a history that some wanted to bury forever. Rumors began to circulate long before the wing was sealed. Whispers in the corridors, offhand remarks in the staff break room, and hushed conversations between doctors all hinted at something amiss. It wasn't unusual for a hospital to have one or two oddities, patients who seemed to disappear without a trace, experimental treatments that didn't always go as planned, the occasional scandal involving the staff. But the sealed wing was different. There was an unease in the air whenever anyone mentioned it, a feeling that something was terribly wrong but no one was willing to admit it. The truth about the wing began to emerge slowly, piece by piece. But by the time the mystery had taken shape, it was already too late. The doors had been locked, the windows covered, and the documents relating to the wing's existence had been removed, hidden, or destroyed. Any attempt to trace the history of this part of the hospital seemed to hit a brick wall. Doctors and nurses who had worked there for years refused to speak about it, while others simply pretended it never existed. The more the investigators pushed, the more the silence grew. It was as though someone had made a collective decision to erase the very existence of the wing from memory. The questions piled up. What had happened in that wing? What kind of experiments had been conducted there? Why had it been sealed off without warning? And most importantly, who was behind the decision to lock the doors and never speak of it again? It wasn't just the patients and staff who were affected by the wing's closure. The very reputation of the hospital had been tarnished by the secrecy surrounding it. People began to wonder if the hospital had been hiding something, whether it was an outbreak, a deadly disease, or something more sinister. The community grew increasingly suspicious, and the more time passed, the harder it became to ignore the growing whispers of conspiracy. Something had gone terribly wrong, and the hospital had done everything in its power to bury it. For those who dared to investigate, the sealed wing was a dark, forbidden place. Every attempt to uncover its secrets seemed to hit a dead end. The hospital administrators remained tight-lipped, and the staff who had worked there were either silent or reluctant to talk. But there were a few who remembered, the ones who had witnessed strange things, who had seen the wing before it was sealed. These were the people who had the answers, the ones who could shed light on the truth. As the investigation deepened, more and more disturbing facts came to light. The sealed wing was once home to a wide range of patients, from those suffering from severe mental illnesses to individuals who had been subjected to experimental treatments. Some of the patients were never seen again, while others were discharged under mysterious circumstances. The files on these individuals were either incomplete or had been erased entirely. It was as though someone was trying to erase any trace of what had happened inside the walls of the sealed wing. There were whispers of medical malpractice, unethical experiments, and cover-ups. Some believed that the hospital had been involved in secret government projects, while others thought it might have been connected to a string of disappearances that had plagued the city for years. The deeper the investigation went, the darker the truth became. The sealed wing wasn't just a forgotten part of the hospital. It was a place where untold horrors had occurred and no one wanted to talk about it. The haunting silence surrounding the wing seemed to hold everyone in its grip. Even those who had once worked there seemed to have forgotten what had happened, or perhaps they were simply too afraid to speak up. But the more the investigators dug, the clearer it became that something truly terrible had occurred in that wing, something that the hospital wanted to keep hidden at all costs. There was one nurse who had worked in the sealed wing, a woman who had been there from the very beginning. She had witnessed things that no one else had seen, things that still haunted her to this day. But when she was asked to speak about it, she grew quiet, refusing to answer. There were others, too, patients who had been in the wing before it was sealed, who remembered strange occurrences, but who were too frightened to tell their stories. Each of them had their own pieces of the puzzle, but no one dared to put it together. What had happened in that wing? Why had it been sealed off and forgotten? The more questions were asked, the more the mystery seemed to deepen. And as the investigation continued, the sense of unease grew stronger. Something was being hidden, something that would change everything. But would anyone ever uncover the truth? Would anyone ever be brave enough to open the doors that had been locked away for so long? And so, the hospital's secret remained just that, a secret. But the truth always has a way of coming to light, no matter how hard it's hidden. The sealed wing may have been forgotten by many, but for those who were determined to uncover its secrets, the search for the truth was only just beginning. The hospital had been a beacon of hope for so many over the years. Its name was synonymous with cutting-edge medical care, revolutionary treatments, and the promise of healing. The towering structure, once a symbol of progress, now stood as a testament to both the greatness and the darkness that had occurred behind its walls. But no one could deny that there had always been something a little off about it, something buried deep within its history. The building's pristine facade couldn't entirely mask the secrets it harbored. Within its expansive corridors, beyond the gleaming floors and immaculate white walls, a darker, hidden world lurked, concealed from the public eye. That hidden world was the sealed wing, and its story began long before the doors were locked shut forever. The wing had been part of the original design of the hospital, one of the first sections to be constructed. It was meant to house some of the most groundbreaking treatments of the time, catering to patients with rare diseases or conditions that could not be treated anywhere else. At the time, it was considered a marvel, a place where new, experimental procedures were being carried out to save lives that would otherwise be lost. Doctors spoke of it with great pride, touting its advanced medical technology and the innovative treatments taking place within its walls. Patients who were lucky enough to be admitted here were often on the verge of death, their last hope lying in the hands of the hospital's best medical minds. And for a time it worked. The wing's reputation grew, and so did the hospital's. People traveled from across the country and even the world to seek treatment there. But things didn't always go as planned. For all its success stories, the wing began to garner a reputation for something more sinister. It wasn't immediate. At first it seemed like any other hospital ward, albeit with a focus on the more severe cases. However, as the years passed, strange occurrences began to surface. Whispers started to circulate among the staff about the wing's treatments, and more concerningly, about the patients who came and went from there. Some never left at all. Some were transferred to other wings, only to fade into obscurity. Others were said to have disappeared entirely, their names struck from the hospital records as though they had never existed. For some, these were nothing more than rumors, anecdotes passed on by fearful staff members or patients who had heard gossip. But for others, these whispers carried weight. Over time, more than a few people had begun to question what was really going on inside the wing. Patients who once had been treated for relatively common conditions started to exhibit strange symptoms that didn't quite fit with their diagnoses. People would enter the wing seemingly healthy, only to come out bedridden, their bodies wasted away, as if they had been subjected to something unnatural. But when questioned, the staff either couldn't or wouldn't provide any answers. Those who had worked in the wing for years found themselves growing increasingly uncomfortable, some even refusing to speak of it altogether. There were rumors of unethical practices, experimental procedures conducted without proper oversight, patients being used as guinea pigs for treatments that hadn't been fully tested or approved. Others whispered about a darker possibility, that the wing had become a place not for healing but for hiding. In the decades before its sealing, the wing had become an enigma. No one could quite put their finger on what was wrong, but something felt deeply off about it. The regular staff rotations began to dry up, and soon, it became increasingly difficult to find doctors and nurses willing to work in that part of the hospital. Those who did would often leave quickly, citing personal reasons or discomfort with the conditions. Even the patients who came through the wing's doors seemed to be more withdrawn, more distant. There was a strange atmosphere in the air, something that left a chill in the bones of anyone who set foot inside. No one really knew who was responsible for the wing's steady descent into obscurity. By the time rumors reached the ears of the hospital administration, it was already too late. The damage had been done. The sealed wing had become a place of fear and uncertainty, a place that no one wanted to talk about, a place that no one dared to visit. The first attempt to shut down the wing had been met with resistance. Doctors, nurses, and administrators all played their part in concealing the truth. But the more the hospital ignored the growing issues, the more the public began to demand answers. Something was wrong and they wanted to know what. Eventually, the hospital faced public scrutiny. The mounting pressure and a series of inquiries pushed the administration to take action. But instead of offering transparency, they chose to sweep it all under the rug. The wing was closed off, its doors sealed with no explanation, and the staff was quietly reassigned to other parts of the hospital. No one spoke of it. No one explained why it had happened or what had gone on in that isolated corner of the building. It was as if the entire chapter had been erased from the hospital's history, left to rot in the forgotten archives of time. Patients who had been treated there were either relocated or quietly dismissed, their cases either unresolved or closed prematurely. The sealed wing became a taboo subject, one that no one wanted to revisit. But behind closed doors, the investigation into the sealed wing had already begun. The closure of the wing might have silenced the hospital for a while, but it only deepened the intrigue surrounding it. Those who had worked there or who had been in the wing before it was sealed off, found themselves with lingering questions. Some of them were too frightened to ask these questions aloud, but they could not shake the feeling that something truly terrible had been hidden away. These were the people who had seen the wing from the inside, who had known what had gone on behind its walls. It wasn't just the eerie atmosphere or the rumors that lingered, it was the unmistakable sense that something had been deliberately concealed. The records were incomplete, the patients' files vanished, and even some of the doctors and nurses had been quietly moved out of the facility without so much as a goodbye. Despite the hospital's best efforts to bury the truth, some of these former staff members and patients began to speak up, cautiously at first, but the more they shared, the clearer it became that there were dark forces at play. A few brave individuals managed to come forward, willing to share what they had witnessed. But their accounts were fragmented and incomplete, as if they too had been a part of the mystery. Some spoke of medical treatments that bordered on the unethical, while others alluded to a much darker truth, one that the hospital was willing to go to great lengths to keep hidden. In the early days after the wing's closure, investigators and journalists alike sought answers. But the deeper they dug, the more resistance they encountered. Every door they knocked on seemed to lead to another dead end. It wasn't that the hospital wasn't willing to help, they simply didn't have any answers. There were no records, no reports, no files to examine. It was as if the wing had never existed at all. The more the investigators probed, the more they were faced with silence. The sealed wing wasn't just a mystery, it was a void. And the harder they tried to uncover the truth, the more elusive it became. But one thing was clear, the wing had been a place of extreme secrecy, and whatever had happened within those walls was something that someone, perhaps many people, wanted forgotten. But even now, long after the doors had been locked, the truth remained just out of reach. The investigation had only just begun, and the deeper they dug, the more chilling the mystery became. What had truly gone on inside that sealed wing? And who was going to stop at nothing to keep it hidden? As the days passed and the investigation into the sealed wing continued, the whispers grew louder. The hospital, once an institution of trust and care, now stood at the center of a growing storm of suspicion. More and more people began to wonder what had really gone on behind the locked doors. The building itself, with its cold, sterile hallways and bright, impersonal rooms, had always felt like a place of healing, of second chances. But now, for many, it represented something far darker, something hidden, something twisted. The sealed wing became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Its mere existence, shrouded in secrecy, seemed to suggest a much larger conspiracy, one that reached far beyond the walls of the hospital. At first, the hospital's administrators had remained tight-lipped, offering nothing more than a vague statement that the wing was temporarily closed for restructuring or renovation. There was no mention of the patients who had been in that part of the building, no mention of the staff who had worked there. The official story was simple, a closure for routine maintenance. But as the rumors spread and the pressure mounted, cracks began to appear in the hospital's story. The more questions were asked, the more the truth seemed to slip further from reach. It became increasingly clear that something had gone terribly wrong in that wing, and no one from the highest-ranking officials to the janitors who swept the hallways was willing to talk about it. The first significant break in the investigation came when an anonymous tip led investigators to a former nurse who had worked in the sealed wing. She had been one of the last people to leave the ward before it was shut down, and she was said to have knowledge of what had happened there. However, she was hesitant to speak at first. The fear in her eyes was palpable, and when she was approached, she looked over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear out of nowhere to stop her from talking. But eventually, she agreed to meet with a journalist who had been investigating the case. Her account, however fragmented and incomplete, would prove to be one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. She spoke in hushed tones as though afraid someone might overhear her. Her hands trembled as she recounted the strange events that had unfolded in the sealed wing, but she was careful not to give too much away at once. She spoke of the patients who had been there long before the wing was sealed. Many of them had entered the hospital with common conditions, illnesses that could be treated and managed with conventional medical practices. But for some reason they had been placed in the sealed wing, often without explanation. Some of the patients had died there, while others had mysteriously vanished. She could not explain why, but she had witnessed it herself, patients who entered the wing alive only to be seen no more. There was one patient in particular who stood out in her memory, a man who had been admitted with what seemed like a routine illness. He had been placed in the sealed wing for observation, and over the course of a few weeks, his condition had worsened. But it wasn't just the physical decline that troubled her, it was the strange behavior he exhibited. He began to speak in nonsensical phrases, claiming that he had seen things, heard things that no one else could. His words were incoherent, but they were chilling nonetheless. According to the nurse, he had become obsessed with the idea that someone, was watching him. But it wasn't until one night, when he had been alone in his room, that things took a darker turn. She had heard him screaming for help, his voice piercing the otherwise quiet night, but when she arrived at his room, he was gone. His bed was empty and there were no signs of a struggle. His disappearance had never been explained. She spoke of other disappearances like this, patients who had vanished without a trace, their files wiped clean, their names erased from the records. It was as if they had never been there at all. The nurse's story raised more questions than it answered. Why had these patients been placed in the sealed wing? What had happened to them? And who was responsible for their disappearances? As she spoke, the fear in her voice was unmistakable. She had witnessed things in that wing that no one should ever have to see, things that still haunted her to this day. But despite the fear, there was also a sense of guilt in her words, guilt that she had not done more to stop what had been happening. She admitted that she had tried to speak out at one point, but she had been silenced. Threats had been made, and she had been warned to keep quiet if she valued her job or her safety. In the end, she had complied, but the weight of the truth continued to gnaw at her. Her testimony was just one piece of the puzzle, but it was a crucial one. It provided the first tangible clue that something truly sinister had been taking place in that wing. But it also raised the stakes. If the nurse's account was to be believed, it meant that the hospital had been involved in something far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. This was no ordinary medical malpractice or administrative failure. The sealed wing wasn't just a forgotten part of the hospital. It was a place where people had been subjected to experiments, where patients had been treated like nothing more than test subjects. It was a place where lives had been destroyed. As the investigation continued, more former staff members came forward, each with their own disturbing accounts. One doctor, who had worked in the wing for years, revealed that there had been discussions about conducting advanced treatments, which were never properly documented or approved. These treatments were not part of any clinical trials, and there were no official records of them being performed. The doctor admitted that he had been part of these treatments, though he had always questioned their legitimacy. But like the others, he had kept quiet, fearing the consequences of speaking out. It wasn't until the wing was sealed off that he realized the extent of what had been happening. Meanwhile, patients who had been treated in the sealed wing began to speak out as well. Some were hesitant at first, still haunted by their experiences, but eventually they too came forward. Their accounts were eerily similar: strange procedures, unexplainable symptoms, and in some cases outright negligence on the part of the medical staff. Some of them had been part of experimental trials, though they had never been told what the trials were for. Others had been given treatments that seemed to make their conditions worse, not better. The more these patients shared, the clearer it became. The sealed wing had been a place where the boundaries of medical ethics had been pushed, perhaps even broken. But amid all the revelations, there was still one question that lingered above the rest. Why had it all been kept so secret? Why had the wing been sealed without warning or explanation? And who was pulling the strings behind the scenes, ensuring that the truth never saw the light of day? As the investigation drew closer to the heart of the mystery, it became evident that the answers would not be easy to uncover. Someone, perhaps more than one person, had gone to great lengths to hide the truth. And the closer the investigators got to revealing what had happened in the sealed wing, the more dangerous the pursuit became. The deeper the investigation went, the more layers of deception and manipulation were uncovered. There were forces at play that were far more powerful than anyone had anticipated, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep the truth buried. The sealed wing was just the beginning of a much larger, more complex web of corruption and secrecy. But who was behind it all? And what were they willing to do to protect their darkest secrets? With each passing day, the mystery deepened and the stakes grew higher. The investigation had only just begun, but one thing was clear. The truth was far more terrifying than anyone had ever imagined. The day the sealed wing was locked for the last time, a sense of finality descended over the hospital. But it wasn't the kind of finality that brought closure or peace. Instead, it was a heavy, oppressive silence that followed. The doors were locked, the windows sealed, and the once bustling hallways stood eerily still. Outside, life in the city continued as normal, but inside the hospital, everything had shifted. The hospital administration, despite their best efforts, could no longer avoid the mounting pressure. The questions were piling up, and there were whispers everywhere, among the staff, the patients, and the families of those who had passed through the doors of that forgotten wing. What had happened there? Why had it been sealed off so suddenly with no explanation? And perhaps most disturbingly, what was being hidden? The sealed wing had always been a part of the hospital's history, but it had never been fully understood by the public. The average person had no reason to question what went on behind its doors. The hospital had an air of professionalism and trustworthiness, and the wing, though isolated and mysterious, was simply another part of the hospital. It had a purpose, or so everyone thought. But now, with the wing sealed off, with the hospital refusing to answer any questions, everything had changed. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted. Investigators began to dig deeper, trying to uncover the truth about what had really happened in the sealed wing. They knew it wasn't just an ordinary medical unit that had been closed for maintenance or a routine overhaul. Something more sinister had occurred. As the investigation intensified, they started to look beyond the surface-level explanations. They began to talk to former staff members, patients, and anyone who had been involved with the wing before its closure. But no one was willing to talk. For the first time, the walls of the hospital seemed impenetrable. People who had once been willing to share their stories, doctors, nurses, even former patients, were suddenly tight-lipped. The same people who had once been willing to speak off the record were now afraid to say anything. There was a palpable fear in the air. Those who had worked in the wing before its sealing were either too terrified to speak up or had been silenced one way or another. The more investigators pushed for answers, the more resistance they encountered. It was as if an invisible force was actively keeping them from uncovering the truth. But what was that force? And who was behind it? It wasn't until one particularly persistent journalist got wind of a rumor that the first breakthrough occurred. The rumor suggested that a high-ranking hospital official, someone with power and influence, had been involved in making the decision to seal off the wing. This official was someone whose name had been spoken in hushed tones, whose authority extended far beyond the hospital's walls. They were a figure of immense power within the medical community, someone whose connections ran deep. But no one could confirm the rumors. Every attempt to dig into the official's past, their involvement in the decision, or their potential connection to the wing's closure seemed to hit dead ends. At first, the journalist was met with resistance from every angle. Records were either incomplete or disappeared altogether. Staff members were either unwilling to speak or flat out denied any knowledge of the situation. The more the journalist uncovered, the more the situation became clear. The higher-ups at the hospital were actively working to suppress information. It was as though they were willing to go to any lengths to make sure the secrets of the sealed wing stayed buried. But this journalist refused to back down. Something didn't add up, and they were determined to find out what. They started speaking to former patients of the wing. Many of them had been discharged with vague explanations, some even claiming they hadn't been fully informed of what had been happening during their stay. The patients who had been there for treatment told stories of strange procedures, of being asked to participate in experimental treatments without their consent, and of feeling like they had been treated like lab rats rather than patients. Some of the more vocal patients began to question the ethics of what had been done to them. Why hadn't they been informed of the treatments they were receiving? Why had they been subjected to such procedures without their knowledge or consent? And most hauntingly, why had so many of them felt that something had been deliberately hidden from them during their time in the sealed wing? The more these patients shared, the more disturbing the revelations became. Some had been admitted for routine treatments, only to find themselves part of a larger, more questionable experiment. Others had been kept in the wing for months, only to be discharged without any explanation as to why they had been kept there for so long. The stories were becoming impossible to ignore. The sealed wing wasn't just a place for medical treatment, it was a place for something far darker. A place where the boundaries of ethical medical practices had been pushed, where patients had been used as test subjects without their consent. The investigation led the journalist to a key piece of evidence, a set of medical records that had been left behind in an abandoned office within the hospital. These records, which had somehow slipped through the cracks of the hospital's meticulous paperwork, were the first concrete evidence the journalist had found that linked the sealed wing to illegal medical experiments. The documents revealed that several patients had been part of unauthorized trials, receiving treatments that had never been approved by the hospital's ethics board or the relevant medical authorities. The treatments, according to the records, were experimental and had been designed to push the limits of what was considered acceptable in medical research. But the records didn't stop there. They also revealed that some of the patients had suffered adverse effects from these treatments, some of which were so severe that they had been removed from the trial without explanation. This new information was both shocking and validating. It confirmed what many had suspected for years. The sealed wing had been a place where ethical boundaries had been crossed, where patients had been subjected to cruel, experimental treatments. But what was even more troubling was the fact that this information had been deliberately concealed. The hospital had gone to great lengths to ensure that no one would ever learn the truth about what had happened behind those closed doors. The investigation into the sealed wing was not just an inquiry into one hospital's dark secrets. It was a window into a much larger, far-reaching conspiracy. The deeper the journalists dug, the more they uncovered. The pieces of the puzzle started to come together, but each revelation only led to more questions. The investigation had opened a door, but it was a door that led into an abyss. The more they learned, the more dangerous the pursuit of the truth became. People who had once been willing to cooperate with the investigation suddenly withdrew, and threats began to emerge. It was clear that someone with power, was willing to do whatever it took to stop the truth from coming out. But despite the mounting pressure, the journalist pressed on, determined to uncover the full extent of the hospital's secrets. The sealed wing was no longer just a forgotten part of the hospital's history, it had become a symbol of something much larger. It was a microcosm of corruption, secrecy, and manipulation. It was a place where lives had been destroyed, where the boundaries of medical ethics had been blurred beyond recognition. But who was behind it all? And how far would they go to keep their secrets buried? As the investigation reached its peak, the journalists found themselves at the center of a storm. The hospital administration, now fully aware of the inquiry, had begun to push back with everything they had. The media was starting to take notice, but so were the people who had been involved in the darker side of the hospital's history. The sealed wing had become a battleground, and those who sought the truth were now facing an enemy unlike anything they had ever encountered. But the journalist was not about to back down. The truth, no matter how dark or dangerous, was worth fighting for. And they were ready to risk everything to make sure it was uncovered. As the investigation progressed, the intensity around the sealed wing grew, and the pressure from all sides became suffocating. What had initially seemed like an isolated incident began to unfold into something much larger, something far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The authorities were getting involved now, but not in the way that the investigators had hoped. Instead of providing the clarity and transparency they so desperately needed, they were met with increasing resistance and a constant flow of red tape. Every door they knocked on seemed to lead to yet another obstacle. The deeper they dug, the harder it became to see the truth. But the investigators knew one thing for certain. There was a conspiracy here, and it was designed to keep the horrors of the sealed wing hidden from the world. The sealed wing had always been a place of mystery, but as the investigation gained momentum, it was clear that this was not just a closed unit within a hospital, it was the center of something far darker, a place where the lines between ethics, medicine, and power had been completely erased. The more investigators uncovered, the more they began to question not just the hospital, but the very systems that had allowed this kind of abuse to flourish in the first place. They knew they were onto something big, but they also understood the risks of getting too close to the truth. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. And yet, despite the looming threats, they had no choice but to continue. The victims, those whose lives had been destroyed, deserved justice. They had to know what had happened to them. The first break in the case came from an unexpected source. A former employee who had worked in the hospital for decades, someone who had seen the hospital's rise to prominence and its slow, steady descent into something far more sinister. This individual had spent years as part of the maintenance staff, someone who had worked in the underbelly of the hospital, fixing the infrastructure that kept everything running. But this person had witnessed things that couldn't be ignored. Over the years, they had seen patients being moved into the sealed wing, patients who had come in with perfectly treatable conditions, only to be lost to the system. No one ever spoke about them again, and the files on their cases simply disappeared. The former employee spoke of a night that still haunted them, a night when they had been tasked with maintaining the area around the sealed wing. They had heard strange noises emanating from behind the locked doors, noises that didn't seem to belong to any ordinary hospital. They were sounds of distress, of someone, suffering. The maintenance worker had known the layout of the hospital well and had always kept a low profile, never involved in the higher-ups' decisions. But something about that night didn't sit right. The noises were unlike anything they had ever heard in the hospital before. They described walking past the sealed wing in the dead of night, when the corridors were eerily quiet, and hearing the unmistakable sound of muffled screams. At first they thought they were imagining things, but then the noises grew louder, more desperate. It was a cry for help, one that had been silenced behind those locked doors for far too long. But when they went to report it, no one seemed to care. The administrators had shut down any questions, brushing off any concerns. They were told, as were others, that the wing was part of an ongoing experimental treatment that needed to be kept under wraps for reasons that could not be disclosed to the public. But the employee wasn't convinced. And it wasn't just the noises that troubled them, it was the look in the eyes of the staff members who had worked in the wing. They were different, cold, detached. They no longer showed any signs of the empathy that one would expect from medical professionals. The maintenance worker's account added another layer to the mystery. They weren't the only one who had heard the screams either. Another former nurse, someone who had worked in the wing before its closure, came forward with their own harrowing account. This nurse spoke of the drastic changes in the patient's behavior once they were moved into the sealed wing. These patients, who had come in seeking treatment for relatively mild ailments, began to exhibit strange and disturbing symptoms. Some became paranoid, convinced that they were being watched. Others became completely withdrawn, unwilling or unable to communicate. Many of them would mutter incoherently, repeating phrases that didn't make sense. But it wasn't just the patients who changed, it was the staff too. The nurse described a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The air itself felt different in that wing, as though something had taken hold of the people inside it, something insidious, something that made them forget their basic medical ethics. As the nurse continued their story, they revealed more disturbing details. Patients were often subjected to experimental treatments, drugs that had not been properly tested or approved. They were told that these treatments were designed to cure them, but no one knew what the side effects would be. And when things went wrong, when patients started to deteriorate, when they exhibited symptoms that no one could explain, the staff was instructed to keep quiet. Those who asked too many questions were quietly transferred out of the wing, reassigned to other departments. The nurse, who had been new at the time, was one of the first to speak out. But when they tried to voice their concerns, they were quickly silenced. The hospital's administration had a strong hold over its staff, and those who questioned the practices were quietly pushed out. It became clear that the sealed wing wasn't just a forgotten part of the hospital. It was a place where the boundaries of medical experimentation had been tested, pushed beyond ethical limits, all under the guise of progress. But the most chilling part of the nurse's account was the mention of a specific patient who had been admitted to the sealed wing just before it was shut down. This patient, a young woman, had arrived with a seemingly treatable condition. But she was one of the last to leave the wing, and when she did, she was not the same. Her family reported her strange behavior after her discharge. She had become distant, unrecognizable, like a shell of the person she had once been. Her eyes, they said, were empty. She would not speak of what had happened to her during her time in the sealed wing. But the most disturbing detail of all was that no one seemed to know where she had gone after her release. Her family searched for answers, but there were no records, no explanations. It was as if she had been erased from the hospital's history entirely. The nurse's testimony added a new dimension to the investigation. It was no longer just about a series of unethical medical treatments. It was about the complete erasure of patients, the destruction of lives, and the cover-up of a medical atrocity. And yet, even with this new information, the hospital continued to refuse to cooperate. Every door the investigators knocked on seemed to lead to another dead end. The records were incomplete, the staff too frightened to speak, and the administration remained steadfast in their silence. It was as if they had prepared for this moment long before the investigation had even begun. But the more the investigators pressed, the more they realized that the sealed wing was not just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger network of corruption, one that extended beyond the hospital and into the highest echelons of power. Someone or some group had orchestrated this cover-up, and they would stop at nothing to make sure the truth remained hidden. The deeper the investigation went, the more dangerous the pursuit became. Those who were getting too close to the truth began to receive threatening messages, and some of them simply vanished, their investigations abandoned, their names erased from the records. The journalists, however, refused to back down. They knew that uncovering the full extent of the sealed wing's horrors could be the key to exposing a larger, more terrifying network of malpractice and deceit. But the further they dug, the more they realized that they weren't just fighting a corrupt hospital, they were up against something much bigger. The sealed wing was just one part of a much darker picture, and the fight for the truth was far from over. The investigation into the sealed wing was no longer just about uncovering a series of unethical medical practices or one hospital's dark past. With each passing day, it became apparent that this was a much larger conspiracy, one that spanned far beyond the walls of the hospital. The deeper the investigators dug, the more they began to uncover a web of connections, secrecy, and corruption that reached the highest levels of power, both within the medical field and the government. What had initially seemed like a singular, isolated event now appeared to be a small part of a much more insidious, far-reaching agenda. And with every new lead, every new piece of evidence, the stakes grew higher. It wasn't just the hospital that was implicated anymore. The sealed wing, a place that had once been thought of as an inconsequential part of a larger institution, had now become the epicenter of a series of shadowy dealings. The more the investigators spoke to former employees, former patients, and those who had been involved in the hospital's most secretive operations, the more the truth began to emerge. This was no longer a case of medical malpractice gone wrong. This was a deliberate, calculated effort to conduct experiments on human lives, to test new medical treatments and procedures on vulnerable patients without their knowledge or consent. And those who had attempted to expose the truth were being systematically silenced. One of the most shocking discoveries came from a former high-ranking employee, someone who had worked in the hospital's administration for years and had access to confidential files that were now locked away. This employee, an individual whose name had never once come up in the investigation before, had knowledge of the real reasons behind the sealing of the wing. According to their testimony, the wing had been shut down not due to renovations or restructuring as the public was told, but because a series of experiments had gone horribly wrong. These were experiments that were never approved by the hospital's board, let alone the relevant medical oversight committees. The patients who had been placed in the wing were, in fact, nothing more than guinea pigs for these experiments, subjected to untested drugs, dangerous medical procedures, and treatments that could only be described as unethical at best and criminal at worst. But the most disturbing part of this whistleblower's account was the revelation that the sealed wing wasn't just a place for rogue experiments. It had been used as a front for a much larger, much more secretive operation. The whistleblower explained that the hospital had been working with outside organizations, companies, government agencies, and research labs that were interested in testing new medical technologies and pharmaceuticals on human subjects without the usual regulations. These entities, which had far-reaching power and influence, had turned a blind eye to the ethics of these experiments. The sealed wing had become their laboratory, a place where the rules of conventional medicine were bent, ignored, or outright broken. And those who sought to expose the operation were either bought off, intimidated, or removed from the picture altogether. The more the whistleblower spoke, the more it became clear. The sealed wing had been a part of a much larger, more dangerous network of corruption. The hospital had not only been involved in illegal medical practices, but it had also been used as a tool by powerful organizations to further their own agendas. The experiments in the sealed wing were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader plan to push the boundaries of medical science, no matter the cost to the individuals involved. But it wasn't just the people within the hospital who were complicit in this scheme. The investigation uncovered that individuals within the local government had been aware of the operations taking place in the sealed wing and had actively chosen to ignore or cover up the evidence. Local politicians, law enforcement, and even health officials had turned a blind eye to the mounting evidence of wrongdoing, either because they were bribed or because they were complicit in the scheme themselves. It was a network of corruption that extended far beyond the walls of the hospital, and it seemed that no one was willing to take a stand against it. The more investigators dug, the more the conspiracy began to take shape. The sealed wing was just one part of a far-reaching medical operation, one that had been going on for years. The hospital had served as a testing ground for pharmaceutical companies, biotechnology firms, and research labs that were eager to push the boundaries of science, regardless of the ethical implications. These companies had provided funding, technology, and resources to the hospital, and in return, they had been granted access to the patients who had been placed in the sealed wing. The patients were often not told about the true nature of their treatments, and many were kept in the dark about the experimental drugs they were being given. These drugs, it turned out, were still in the testing phase, and their long-term effects were unknown. But no one cared about the risks. The goal was to push the limits of medical science, no matter who got hurt in the process. One of the most chilling aspects of this operation was the role that the hospital played in recruiting vulnerable patients for these experiments. These patients were often those who had been rejected from other hospitals, individuals with rare or complicated conditions that no one else had been able to treat. They were desperate for a cure, and the hospital offered them hope. But what these patients didn't know was that they were being used as test subjects for treatments that hadn't been approved, for procedures that were still in the early stages of development. Many of these patients never survived the treatments. Others were left with debilitating side effects that had lifelong consequences. But none of it mattered. The hospital was paid, the research companies were satisfied, and the powerful people behind the scenes continued to reap the rewards. The more the investigation revealed, the more disturbing the truth became. The sealed wing was not just a place where medical ethics were ignored, it was a place where human lives were sacrificed for the sake of profit and progress. The patients who had passed through its doors were not treated with dignity or respect. They were exploited, used as nothing more than tools in a high-stakes game of scientific experimentation. And the hospital administrators, the doctors, the researchers, and the politicians who had been complicit in the operation were willing to do whatever it took to keep the truth hidden. The deeper the investigators pushed, the more they realized that this was no longer just a hospital cover-up. It was a vast conspiracy involving powerful people who were willing to destroy anyone who threatened to expose their secrets. But despite the threats, the intimidation, and the growing danger, the investigation continued. The investigators had uncovered enough evidence to know that this was a story that had to be told, no matter the cost. The sealed wing, once thought to be a mere medical anomaly, was now a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world of medical science, of the way that power and greed could override the sanctity of human life. And the more the truth came to light, the more determined the investigators became to bring those responsible to justice. In the end, the sealed wing was not just a symbol of one hospital's dark past, it was a symbol of the dark side of medical progress itself. It was a place where the search for answers had been corrupted by the very people who were supposed to be providing the answers. It was a place where the boundaries of medical ethics had been blurred, and where the suffering of innocent people had been ignored for the sake of profit. The sealed wing was a warning, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the lengths to which some would go to hide the truth. And as the investigation reached its climax, the question on everyone's mind remained: who would pay the price for the lives that had been lost, and would the truth ever fully come to light? As the investigation into the sealed wing continued to unravel, the walls around the hospital seemed to close in. Every attempt to reveal the truth was met with greater resistance, as if powerful hands were pushing back against the search for justice. But the more the investigators exposed, the clearer it became that the sealed wing wasn't just a dark chapter of the hospital's history, it was a flashpoint in a much larger narrative about the exploitation of human lives for the sake of medical and scientific progress. Despite the numerous roadblocks, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place. Investigators, journalists, and whistleblowers all began to corroborate each other's stories. The sealed wing had been a covert operation, a place where vulnerable patients had been used as test subjects for unapproved treatments. But there was more to it than that. There was a systemic failure, a perversion of the very principles that medical institutions are supposed to uphold. The sealed wing had become a site of experimentation, where the lives of patients were disregarded in favor of cutting-edge and often dangerous medical practices. But it wasn't just a handful of rogue doctors who were responsible. It was a deeply entrenched network of powerful individuals within the hospital, medical research organizations, pharmaceutical companies, and even government officials who had allowed this to happen, and in many cases actively facilitated it. The investigation had revealed that the sealed wing's operations weren't a random occurrence or an isolated mistake. This was a carefully orchestrated effort to bypass ethical and legal standards in the pursuit of medical advancement. And those who had participated in these experiments had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks, ensuring that there would be no trace of the human suffering that had taken place. Medical records had been altered or destroyed. Files had gone missing. Witnesses had been silenced, either through intimidation, coercion, or even outright threats to their livelihoods. The web of secrecy was so vast, so all-encompassing, that it became almost impossible to know where the conspiracy began and where it ended. At the heart of it all were the patients, people who had placed their trust in the hospital, believing they were there to receive treatment and care. Many of them were suffering from conditions that were either rare or chronic, and they had come to the hospital seeking help when no other facility could provide answers. For them, the sealed wing represented hope. It was supposed to be a place of advanced care, where medical professionals would work tirelessly to find solutions to their problems. But instead, they were subjected to experimental procedures, dangerous treatments, and drug trials that had not been properly vetted or approved. The patients, often unaware of what was happening to them, became the unwilling subjects of a dark experiment. Their bodies and minds were pushed to the limit as doctors and researchers tested untested treatments on them, with no regard for their safety, let alone their informed consent. One of the most gut-wrenching revelations came from the family members of patients who had been treated in the sealed wing. These families spoke out, demanding answers about what had happened to their loved ones. One particularly tragic case involved a young woman who had been diagnosed with a common autoimmune disorder. She was initially hopeful when she was admitted to the sealed wing for treatment, believing that the hospital could provide the help she so desperately needed. But within weeks, her condition began to deteriorate rapidly. She started exhibiting strange neurological symptoms: tremors, confusion, memory loss. Her family, confused and alarmed, tried to ask the doctors for answers, but their questions were met with vague responses and assurances that everything was normal. It wasn't until months later, after the woman's death, that the family learned the truth. The woman had been part of a drug trial involving an experimental treatment for autoimmune disorders, treatment that had never been approved for use on humans. Her symptoms, the doctors admitted off the record, were a result of the drug's severe side effects. But the hospital refused to acknowledge this, and the woman's case was buried under a pile of medical paperwork and legal documents designed to shield the hospital from liability. Her family, devastated by the loss, began to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding her treatment. What they uncovered was a pattern of similar stories: patients who had entered the sealed wing with routine, treatable conditions and emerged with devastating consequences. Some of them died, some of them were left with permanent disabilities, and some of them simply vanished from the hospital's records entirely. But all of them were victims of a system that had exploited their desperation and used their bodies as fodder for dangerous, unapproved experiments. The more the family uncovered, the more they realized that their loved one was just one of many who had been discarded by the very institution that was supposed to heal them. The sealed wing had been a graveyard for their hopes and dreams, a place where lives were destroyed in the name of scientific progress. As the investigation continued to gain traction, the story began to spread beyond the hospital's walls. Media outlets picked up the pieces of the puzzle, and soon the public's outrage was deafening. People across the country were horrified by the revelations of what had happened in the sealed wing. The families of victims, the survivors, and the whistleblowers who had dared to come forward were all speaking out, demanding justice. But as the pressure mounted, so too did the attempts to suppress the truth. The hospital, and those who were complicit in the operation, used their considerable influence to silence the media, intimidate witnesses, and prevent further investigation. But the truth had already begun to leak out. The sealed wing was no longer just an obscure part of the hospital's history. It had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the medical establishment. The public demanded accountability, and the hospital's attempt to brush the scandal under the rug was failing. At this point, the investigation had become a battle not just for justice but for the future of medical ethics itself. If the conspiracy surrounding the sealed wing was allowed to go unpunished, it would set a dangerous precedent, one that could potentially open the door for similar abuses to take place in hospitals across the country and perhaps the world. The story of the sealed wing was no longer just about one hospital's corruption. It had become a call to action, a rallying cry for those who believed in the sanctity of human life and the importance of medical integrity. The stakes had never been higher. But as the investigation reached its peak, the forces behind the cover-up began to fight back with even greater ferocity. Powerful individuals who had once been untouchable were now on the defensive, using every tool at their disposal to protect themselves and their interests. They were willing to do whatever it took to silence the truth, even if it meant going to extreme lengths. Investigators who had been making significant progress began to receive anonymous threats. Whistleblowers found themselves in danger, their personal lives under siege. Family members of the victims were harassed and intimidated, and journalists who had been following the story found themselves subjected to smears and misinformation campaigns. But despite the mounting pressure, the investigators and journalists refused to back down. They knew that the truth had to be told no matter the cost. In the face of growing opposition, the investigation reached a tipping point. A final, crucial piece of evidence surfaced, an internal document that had been leaked from the hospital's administration. The document outlined the full extent of the experiments that had taken place in the sealed wing, including detailed reports on the patients who had been involved and the procedures that had been conducted. The document provided irrefutable proof of the hospital's complicity in the experiments, and it was the smoking gun that investigators had been searching for. The document not only exposed the full scope of the conspiracy but also implicated some of the most powerful figures in the medical field, including top executives from the pharmaceutical companies that had been funding the experiments. With this new evidence, the tide began to turn. Investigators, bolstered by the support of the public and the media, finally had the ammunition they needed to push for legal action. The sealed wing was no longer just a dark chapter in the hospital's history. It was a window into a vast and deeply rooted system of medical corruption. The conspiracy had been exposed, and those responsible would have to face the consequences of their actions. But even as the investigation reached its climax, the question remained, how far would those responsible go to protect themselves? Would the truth be buried once again, or would the families of the victims finally get the justice they deserved? And perhaps most chilling of all, what had been lost in the process? How many lives had been destroyed in the name of progress? And how many more would be sacrificed before the truth finally came to light? The sealed wing, now an indelible symbol of medical exploitation, had left scars that would never fully heal. But for those who had been affected, the fight was far from over. They had seen the darkness that lay hidden behind the walls, and they would stop at nothing to ensure that the truth could never be hidden again. As the investigation gained momentum, the pressure mounted exponentially on those responsible for the horrors within the sealed wing. It wasn't just the hospital's administrators or the medical professionals involved. It was a sprawling network of powerful people who had enabled this operation to persist for so long, all complicit in one of the most egregious breaches of medical ethics in modern history. The sealed wing, once a place of promise for desperate patients, had become a nightmarish testing ground, where human lives were sacrificed for the sake of experimentation, profit, and ambition. But as the walls of secrecy began to crack, a greater, more terrifying question emerged. How far would those in power go to ensure that their secrets remained buried? And what would the victims and the families left in the wake of this tragedy be willing to do to see justice served? The walls surrounding the hospital, both literal and figurative, began to close in. With each new piece of evidence that surfaced, the conspiracy grew wider and more complex. What had begun as a quest for truth had now turned into a battle for survival. The investigation had exposed the dark underbelly of the hospital system, but it had also sparked a series of events that no one could have anticipated. For the whistleblowers, the victims, and the journalists who had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, the fight was only just beginning. But the deeper they ventured, the more they realized that they weren't just up against a corrupt hospital. They were taking on an entire system that had been designed to protect the interests of the powerful, no matter the cost.